Let me tell you about something I see in clinical conversations that on the surface makes absolutely no sense. A patient comes in mid-50s, clearly making a genuine effort with their health. They've cut out the obvious culprits: no more biscuits, no more white bread, no more fizzy drinks. They've switched to whole grain everything. They're eating fruit every morning. They have low-fat yogurt for a snack. They've replaced their afternoon chocolate bar with a handful of dried mango. By every conventional standard of healthy eating they've been given, by the guidelines, by their GP, by the nutritional labelling on the packaging, they are doing the right things. They tell me with real conviction that their diet has genuinely improved. And then we look at their fasting insulin, and it's elevated. Their triglycerides are high, their HDL is low, their waist circumference is creeping upward despite the fact that they feel they're eating less than they used to. The metabolic picture is not improving. In some cases, it's worse than before they started making changes. Here is what makes this so frustrating for the people experiencing it, and what makes it, frankly, a systemic failure in how dietary advice is communicated. They aren't wrong to think they've improved their diet. By the criteria they were given, they have. The problem is that those criteria were never designed with insulin in mind. They were designed around calories, fat content, and the absence of obviously processed foods. They say nothing at all about how powerfully certain foods that carry a health halo in popular culture drive the insulin response that determines whether the body stores or burns fat, and whether metabolic health improves or quietly deteriorates. The healthiest sounding diet a person can construct from conventional nutritional advice can still drive chronic insulin elevation, and chronic insulin elevation is the engine of almost every metabolic disease we treat. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years working in the AANDE, I've seen the downstream consequences of metabolic disease that began with years of well-intentioned but misdirected dietary choices. Type 2 diabetes in people who thought they were eating healthily, cardiovascular events in patients whose diets looked reasonable on paper, fatty liver in individuals who had genuinely tried to make better decisions and had been failed by the information they were given. My goal now is to give people the framework their GPs and the food industry have never provided, one centered on how food actually affects the hormonal system that determines metabolic health, rather than how it looks on a nutritional label. If you're watching this video, you're probably someone who has made a genuine effort to eat well and who suspects, perhaps from the results they're not seeing, that something about the advice they followed isn't quite right. I want to make you a promise. I promise to keep creating the most evidence-based, clinically honest videos I can, grounded in the latest research and in real experience from the frontline medicine to help you understand how food actually affects your metabolism and your long-term health. All I ask in return is that you give this channel a chance and hit the subscribe button. If you reach the end of this video and you haven't genuinely learned something new, feel free to unsubscribe. No hard feelings at all. But if you give me your time and attention, I will give you everything I've learned from nearly a decade in emergency medicine. Please hit subscribe to help this channel reach more people like you. And let's get into it. To understand why certain foods that are marketed and perceived as healthy are quietly driving insulin elevation, you first need to understand what insulin is, what it does, and why keeping it chronically elevated is one of the most consequential things that can happen to a metabolism over time. Insulin is a hormone produced by the beta cells of the pancreas. Its primary function is to signal to cells, particularly muscle cells, fat cells, and liver cells, to absorb glucose from the bloodstream after a meal. When blood glucose rises following eating, insulin rises in proportion. Glucose is cleared from the blood and directed into storage or energy production, and insulin then falls back toward its baseline. In a metabolically healthy person, this cycle is efficient, proportionate, and brief. Insulin rises, does its job, and falls. The system resets between meals. The problem begins when insulin is chronically elevated, when it does not fall to a genuinely low baseline between meals, because eating patterns, food choices, or underlying insulin resistance keep the system in a continuous state of stimulation. Chronically elevated insulin has a constellation of downstream consequences that explains why it sits at the center of so many metabolic diseases. It signals fat cells to store energy rather than release it, making fat loss functionally impossible regardless of caloric intake. It promotes visceral fat deposition specifically. It drives sodium retention in the kidneys, raising blood pressure. It suppresses the metabolic flexibility to access fat as a fuel source. And over time, as cells become progressively less responsive to its signal, it drives the pancreas to produce more and more, accelerating the progression toward insulin resistance and eventually toward the beta cell exhaustion that defines type 2 diabetes. Chronically elevated insulin is not simply a blood sugar problem. It is a whole system hormonal disorder that touches cardiovascular health, metabolic flexibility, fat storage, blood pressure, and cognitive function simultaneously. Now, with that biological picture in mind, let's talk about why conventional nutritional guidance has failed to protect people from chronic insulin elevation. Because the failure is not accidental. It is a consequence of measuring the wrong things and then building dietary advice around those measurements. Most people have encountered the concept of the glycemic index, a measure of how rapidly a food raises blood glucose, scored on a scale of 0 to 100. It is a useful concept as far as it goes. High glycemic index foods, white bread, white rice, sugary drinks, raise blood glucose rapidly and produce a large fast insulin response. Lower glycemic index foods produce a more gradual rise. On this basis, dietary advice has long recommended lower glycemic choices as metabolically preferable. The problem is that the glycemic index measures glucose response only, and insulin does not respond to glucose alone. There is a second independent dimension of insulin response that the glycemic index entirely misses, the insulinaemic index, which measures how much insulin a food triggers relative to the glucose it delivers. And here is where the framework breaks down for foods that carry a healthy reputation. Some foods, particularly certain dairy products, whey protein, and some low-fat yogurts, produce an insulin response that is substantially higher than their glucose response would predict. Others, like foods high in fructose, deliver minimal glucose to the bloodstream while still driving insulin elevation through fructose's metabolic effects on the liver. The glycemic index does not capture either of these pathways, and dietary advice built around glycemic index alone leaves both entirely invisible. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition demonstrated that the correlation between a food's glycemic index and its insulinaemic index is considerably weaker than most people assume, meaning that low glycemic index foods can still produce significant insulin responses, and that glycemic index alone is an unreliable guide to a food's true impact on the hormonal system that determines metabolic health. The glycemic index tells you what a food does to your blood sugar. It tells you almost nothing about what it does to your insulin, and insulin is the variable that matters most. There are three distinct biological mechanisms through which foods that appear healthy, that carry low calorie counts, health claims, or a wholesome reputation, can drive meaningful insulin elevation. Understanding each of them is essential for making sense of why the specific foods discussed in the next section produce the metabolic consequences they do. The first mechanism is the direct incretin effect. Incretins are gut hormones, particularly GLP-1 and GIP, released in response to food entering the small intestine. Their primary function is to amplify the pancreatic insulin response to a given glucose load, essentially turbocharging the amount of insulin produced relative to the blood glucose rise that the food causes. Certain foods, particularly dairy proteins, specifically whey, stimulate an exceptionally potent incretin response. A glass of milk or a serving of whey protein produces an insulin response that is 2 to 4 times greater than the glucose response would predict. This is not a flaw in the research. It is a consistent, reproducible finding across multiple studies, and it explains why certain high-protein foods that barely raise blood glucose at all can still produce substantial insulin spikes. The second mechanism is hepatic fructose metabolism. Fructose, the sugar found in fruit, honey, many fruit juices, and added to a vast array of processed foods under various names, is metabolized almost entirely in the liver rather than contributing directly to blood glucose. On a blood glucose monitor, a meal high in fructose looks mild. On an insulin monitor, it does not, because the liver's processing of fructose generates metabolic intermediates that promote insulin secretion, drives triglyceride synthesis, and over time contributes to liver fat accumulation, which itself worsens hepatic insulin resistance. The fructose content of a food is essentially invisible to glycemic index measurements, which measure blood glucose response. It is not invisible to the pancreas. The third mechanism is the combined effect of food processing on digestive rate. Many processed foods marketed as healthy, low-fat crackers, rice cakes, multigrain bread, breakfast cereals with added vitamins have been processed in ways that dramatically accelerate their digestion and glucose absorption rate, regardless of whether they contain whole grain ingredients. The physical structure of the food, the particle size of the starch, and the destruction of the fiber matrix during processing all determine how rapidly glucose enters the bloodstream, and processing consistently accelerates this, producing glucose and insulin spikes that the ingredient list does not predict. 3 mechanisms: incretin amplification, fructose-driven hepatic insulin secretion, and processing accelerated digestion, produce insulin responses that conventional nutritional labeling was never designed to measure or communicate. Just very quickly, if you're finding this useful so far, please consider hitting subscribe. It genuinely helps these videos reach more people who need this information. Right, let's get to the specific foods. So let me name the specific foods and categories that are most commonly responsible for hidden insulin elevation in people who believe they are eating healthily. And for each one, let me explain precisely which of the 3 mechanisms is driving the problem. Because the goal here is not simply to tell you what to avoid, it is to give you the biological framework that allows you to evaluate any food, not just the ones on this list. Low-fat flavored yogurt sits at the intersection of 2 insulin-driving problems: the removal of fat, which blunts the rate of gastric emptying and moderates insulin response, is compensated by the addition of sugar or fruit concentrate to restore palatability. The result is a product that is simultaneously low in the macronutrient that would have moderated its insulin impact and high in rapidly absorbed sugars that amplify it. Additionally, dairy proteins, particularly the whey fraction, stimulate a powerful incretin response independent of sugar content, meaning that even plain unsweetened yogurt produces a higher insulin response than its carbohydrate content alone would predict. Low-fat flavored yogurt adds sugar elevation on top of an already elevated dairy insulin response, making it one of the most insulin-stimulating foods in a category that most people consider unambiguously healthy. The low-fat label removes the one thing that would have moderated the insulin response. What remains is the dairy protein incretin effect, plus added sugar. The result is worse metabolically than the full-fat version it replaced. Whole fruit is a different metabolic proposition from fruit juice and blended smoothies, and the difference comes down almost entirely to the fate of the fiber. In whole fruit, fiber is intact within the cellular structure of the food. It slows gastric emptying, delays glucose absorption, and blunts both the glucose and the insulin response. When fruit is juiced or blended to a uniform consistency, the cellular structure is disrupted. Fiber is either removed entirely or rendered unable to slow absorption in the way intact fiber does. The sugars, primarily a mixture of glucose, fructose, and sucrose, are absorbed rapidly. The fructose component drives the hepatic mechanisms described earlier. And because a single glass of orange juice or a medium smoothie typically contains the sugar equivalent of 3 to 4 pieces of fruit, the dose delivered to the liver and the pancreas is substantially higher than whole fruit consumption would produce. Research published in the British Medical Journal found that substituting whole fruit for fruit juice was associated with a significantly lower risk of type 2 diabetes, and that fruit juice consumption was associated with a higher risk, even after controlling for total sugar intake, suggesting that the delivery mechanism matters independently of the sugar quantity. The insulin story of a smoothie is very different from the insulin story of the ingredients it contains in their whole form. A smoothie is not equivalent to eating the fruit it contains. The blending destroys the fiber architecture that moderated the sugar absorption. The glucose and fructose arrive at the liver and pancreas in a concentrated wave. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive finding on the list, because whole grain has become synonymous with metabolically superior in conventional dietary guidance. The distinction that guidance consistently fails to make is the difference between intact whole grains, oats, barley, whole berries, and whole grain flour products. When a whole grain is milled into flour, the physical structure of the grain is destroyed regardless of whether the bran and germ are reincorporated afterward. The starch granules are exposed, digestive enzymes access them rapidly, and the resulting glucose absorption rate is far closer to white flour than to the intact grain from which the flour was theoretically derived. A slice of whole grain bread raises blood glucose at a rate that multiple glycemic studies have found to be not significantly different from white bread in most people. The bran content produces marginally more fibre, which has some benefit for gut health, but it does not meaningfully slow the digestion of the starch that comprises the majority of the bread's content. Multigrain crackers and rice cakes follow the same logic. The grain variety is irrelevant to the insulin response when the physical food structure has been processed into a product that digests rapidly. What matters is not what the grain was, it is what the processing did to its structure. Whole grain flour is still flour. The physical destruction of the grain during milling removes the structural barrier that determined how slowly the intact grain digested. The insulin response reflects the structure, not the grain variety on the label. Dried fruit, raisins, dates, dried mango, dried apricots concentrates the sugar content of fruit by removing the water that constitutes the majority of whole fruit's volume, while leaving the sugar content intact. A small handful of raisins contains the sugar equivalent of a large bunch of grapes at a fraction of the volume, which means it is consumed far more easily, far more quickly, and with far less satiety signaling from the stomach stretch receptors that respond to food volume. The fructose and glucose are delivered rapidly. The fiber, while present, is insufficient to moderate absorption at the concentrated dose being consumed, and the insulin response is substantially higher than whole fruit of equivalent sugar content. Fruit-based snack bars, including many products marketed as natural, raw, or paleo-friendly, are often composed primarily of dates, dried fruits, and honey, which delivers a combination of fructose, glucose, and sucrose in a highly concentrated, rapidly absorbed form. The absence of artificial additives does not make a product metabolically neutral. A date and cashew bar with 5 ingredients can produce a more significant insulin response than a conventional biscuit. Depending on composition and quantity, and the health halo it carries, means most people consume it without the same caloric awareness they would bring to an obviously processed snack. Natural and unprocessed are not synonymous with low insulin impact. Concentrated fructose and glucose in a small volume delivered quickly is a significant metabolic event, regardless of what the wrapper says. Whey protein is the most insulin-stimulating macronutrient per gram of any commonly consumed food, a finding that consistently surprises people who associate protein with metabolic benefit and assume that a protein shake is inherently favorable for blood sugar and insulin. Whey's extraordinary insulinaemic effect is driven by its amino acid composition, particularly leucine, isoleucine, and valine, and by its powerful stimulation of the incretin response described in Phase 3. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has demonstrated that whey protein produces an insulin response comparable to white bread gram for gram of carbohydrate equivalent, despite containing essentially no carbohydrates itself. For people using whey protein shakes as a post-exercise recovery tool, the insulin response is largely appropriate and serves a purpose. Insulin, at that moment, drives amino acids into muscle tissue and accelerates recovery. The problem arises when whey protein shakes are consumed as a between-meal snack, as a breakfast replacement, or as part of a dietary pattern that already carries a high insulin load. In those contexts, the incretin-driven insulin spike from whey is additive to whatever other insulin drivers are present in the day's eating pattern. And in an individual with existing insulin resistance, it compounds a problem rather than addressing it. Whey protein does not raise blood sugar. It raises insulin significantly and independently through a direct incretin mechanism. That distinction matters enormously for anyone managing insulin resistance. The foods described above are not obscure or exotic. They are aggressively marketed as healthy choices, endorsed by mainstream nutritional guidelines, and consumed in good faith by millions of people who are genuinely trying to protect their health. The framework that gave rise to their health reputations, low fat, low calorie, whole grain, natural, was never built around insulin dynamics. It predates the research that demonstrated how powerfully certain foods drive insulin responses that their macronutrient content does not predict. The people eating these foods were not making poor decisions. They were making decisions based on information that was structurally incomplete. That is a failure of the information, not of the individual who followed it. So what is the practical solution? I want to frame this carefully because I am not suggesting that every person needs to eliminate every food described above, or that any of these foods is categorically harmful in all contexts for all individuals. What I am offering is a framework, a set of questions to ask about any food that makes the insulin dimension of eating visible, in a way that conventional nutritional guidance has never managed to do. The most fundamental shift in thinking required is reorienting from caloric and macronutrient labeling toward insulin impact as the primary evaluative criterion. This does not require a laboratory or a continuous glucose monitor, though both are useful tools when accessible. It requires applying the three mechanisms from Phase 3 as a mental filter when evaluating food choices. Does this food contain significant whey or dairy protein? Does it contain concentrated fructose in the form of fruit juice, dried fruit, honey, or added sugars? Has it been processed in a way that destroys the physical food structure, milled into flour, blended, or otherwise stripped of its fiber architecture? If the answer to any of these is yes, the food carries an insulin signal that its label does not communicate, and that signal should be factored into decisions about timing, quantity, and dietary context. The goal is not to eliminate all insulin-stimulating foods. Insulin is not an enemy, it is a hormone performing a necessary function. The goal is to reduce the frequency and magnitude of insulin spikes across the day, to allow insulin to fall to a low baseline between meals, and to restore the metabolic flexibility that chronic insulin elevation suppresses. That requires understanding which foods contribute disproportionately to insulin exposure and managing their timing and quantity accordingly. For each of the high insulin foods identified above, there is a directly substitutable alternative that provides comparable satisfaction, similar or greater nutritional value, and a substantially lower insulin response. Low-fat flavored yogurt is replaced by full-fat plain Greek yogurt, which retains the fat that moderates the insulin response, contains less added sugar, and still provides the protein and probiotic benefit. The insulin response is measurably lower, and the satiety is higher, meaning less is consumed to the same effect. Fruit juice and smoothies are replaced by whole fruit, consumed in its intact form, which delivers the same vitamins, the same fiber, and the same sugar, at a rate of absorption that the intact cellular structure moderates effectively. Whole grain bread and crackers are replaced where possible by intact whole grains, rolled oats, cooked barley, or legumes, whose physical structure remains intact through preparation and whose digestion rate reflects that structure rather than a processing step that occurred at the factory. The patient profile I described in the hook, the person eating what they genuinely believe is a healthy diet and whose metabolic markers are not improving, is one of the most common and most demoralizing situations in preventive medicine. The demoralization is important because it is one of the primary drivers of non-compliance with further dietary advice. If someone has already cut out the obvious dietary villains and their metabolic health has not improved, telling them simply to eat better is both unhelpful and credibility destroying. What they needed and were never given was the framework that explained why the foods they replaced the obvious villains with were still driving the hormonal problem those villains created. I have seen patients who, after understanding the insulin dimension of their diet and making the specific substitutions described above without any reduction in total caloric intake, see meaningful improvements in fasting insulin and triglyceride to HDL ratio within 8 to 12 weeks. Not dramatic changes driven by caloric restriction, but targeted metabolic improvements driven by reducing the insulin signal specifically. The body composition begins to shift. The afternoon energy crashes reduce in frequency and severity. The weight around the abdomen, which was resistant to caloric restriction precisely because chronic insulin was locking the fat storage system, begins to respond. The biology changes because the hormonal driver changed, not because willpower increased. The broader significance of what we have covered in this video extends well beyond dietary choices. It reflects a fundamental misalignment between the framework through which food has been evaluated and communicated to the public, centered on calories, fat content, and the presence or absence of artificial ingredients, and the biological reality of how food affects the hormonal system that determines metabolic health over decades. The health halo that surrounds low-fat yogurt, fruit juice, whole grain bread, and natural snack bars was not constructed from evidence about their insulin impact. It was constructed from evidence about their caloric density, their fat content, and their deviation from obviously processed alternatives. That is a narrow and ultimately insufficient basis for evaluating food's metabolic consequences, and the chronic insulin elevation that conventional healthy eating can still produce, as we have discussed across multiple videos. The primary upstream driver of insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, visceral fat accumulation, and a spectrum of metabolic conditions, whose incidence continues to rise despite decades of dietary guidance. Understanding insulin, how food drives it, which foods drive it disproportionately relative to their apparent healthiness, and how chronic elevation of it reshapes the metabolic landscape over years, is the missing layer in the nutritional education that most people have received. It is not a fringe concept, it is not a contrarian position. It is well-established physiology that has simply not been translated into the dietary advice given to the people most affected by its consequences. So let me bring this full circle. The reason certain healthy foods are raising your insulin is not that you made poor choices. It is that the criteria used to classify those foods as healthy were never designed to evaluate their hormonal impact. Low fat, low calorie, whole grain, and natural are legitimate properties of food, but they are not reliable predictors of insulin response. An insulin response sustained chronically across years of well-intentioned eating is the mechanism driving the metabolic outcomes that those dietary choices were supposed to prevent. The three mechanisms to carry forward from this video are the ones that conventional labeling misses entirely: the incretin amplification of dairy proteins, the hepatic insulin signal of fructose that does not appear in blood glucose, and the processing-driven acceleration of starch digestion that makes whole grain flour products metabolically closer to white flour than to the intact grain they originated from. Apply those three filters to the foods in your current diet, not to eliminate them, but to understand their true insulin footprint, and the metabolic picture of your eating becomes legible in a way it probably has not been before. Eating for your insulin is not a diet. It is the framework that makes every other dietary decision more informed, more targeted, and more effective. If this video gave you something genuinely new today, a way of understanding why your best efforts with food may not be producing the results you expected, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach more people like you who deserve this information.